All right, I'm very happy to convene our next session, our next speaker. I'm Jonathan Hsu. I am on the executive board of RaceB4Race, and I hope you're all having a great time here. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Promise Lee, whose bio is in the program for you to follow up. I just want to say it's kind of strange. I feel like we already know each other from Twitter. Like RaceB4Race is tight, you know. But it's great to finally meet in person. I'm so excited about this talk. The title. Oh, I don't know if the slide is up yet. But anyways, the title of Promise's talk is "Containing the World: Poetics as Racialization and Love's Labor's Lost." Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan, for the wonderful intro. Can folks hear me on the mic? All right. And again, thank you, Ayana, and organizers for the opportunity to be here. And I was just saying to a lot of folks that, you know, this is, I think, I'm not used to being treated this well as a graduate student at an academic conference. Just like so many accommodations and so much nice community. And also thanking everyone who worked to make this happen in the back end, right? Terry, Todd, etc., workers who set up the food and stuff for us. So I just really want to underscore that, and thanks everyone for showing up to the very last panel. So my talk is actually pretty similar to Priya's talk on the very first session, right? So I'm on form and race, so I feel pretty glad to end by revisiting similar materials in Shakespeare and returning to where we started, right? Which is also fitting because my talk is going to be about poetic unities. So in today's presentation, I want to interrogate the relationship between poetics and race by beginning with a basic question. What did poetics mean in the Renaissance? Poetics can often function as a placeholder word in scholarship today that generally describes the transformative potentials of creative making. On that note, my methodology today may appear to be rather traditionalist, calling for us to revisit what the early moderns thought about poetics, some of whom can seem more invested in creating rules and legislation for creative making than highlighting the spontaneous capacity of creative making. But as I suggest, it is this conception of poetics that enabled early modern thinkers to develop imaginative resources under the rubric of poetics that help discover new paradigms of racialization that we have yet to uncover fully. My instinct here is not new. I want to recall Ian Smith's observation from his groundbreaking monograph, Race and Rhetoric in the Renaissance, where he writes that, quote, Shakespeare demonstrates that far from being a spontaneous and innocuous instrument of the civilizing process, rhetoric, that is language as racializing and persuasive, is revealed as violent ideological prescription, unquote. I see Smith's observation as a starting point for analysis. What other early modern categories of thought have we taken for granted as merely innocuous? Early modern poetics, which overlaps with rhetoric and largely expresses itself in the practice through drama, systematically demarcates a site concerned with the management and ordering of discourse. Julius Caesar Scaliger, whose work on poetics was seen at the time as a key authority in the subject, treats the poetical art as what he calls a science, a habit of production in accordance with those laws which underlie that symmetrical fashioning known as poetry, unquote. As Michael Hetherington describes, the task for poetics for Scaliger is to, quote, explore the scope of a regulated realm of obligations and norms, unquote. For English poetic theorist George Putnam, poetics' concern with the construction of rules and order has political implications. He writes that the poet should ensure that everything in the world is governed by proportion and protects public peace. Indeed, this turn towards establishing clear customs and parameters for the formal structure of literary production coincides with the rise of early colonial endeavors. In this sense, the construction of poetic unity and coherence can be a crucial site for early modern Europeans to think through how to relate to new encounters that threaten the unity of their cultural fabric. Shakespeare's Love's Labor's Lost is an attempt to draw from contemporary discourses of poetics to make such colonial encounters legible. Love's Labor's Lost is notably one of the few Shakespeare plays alongside The Tempest that adhere closely to the poetic unities of place and time, with the entire drama taking place in the span of one day and nearly one location. In other words, the structure of the play itself formally mimics the circumscription demanded by the King of Navarre himself in the play's Protasis. He writes that he wants to contain his court as, quote, a little academe, still and contemplative in living art. Navarre wants his retainers to accompany him in his war against your own affections, abstaining from pleasure for 3 years to cultivate learning. The argumentum of the play consists of these courtiers' request for self-contained study being repeatedly troubled by visiting French ladies whom the protagonists ultimately court. The play concludes with a temporary delay for a year of the lovers' union, partly due to the death of the French prince's father. At the center of the play's contained narrative arc is a basic principle of comic poetic theory, persuasion. This is established as a general dramatic principle by Renaissance theorists following the Horatian dictum to teach and to delight, such as Scaliger, who describes oratory and poetry as having the same end, that of persuasion. German comic theorist Willichius' commentaries and Terence, foundationally used and read in English schools in the Elizabethan period, more specifically saw even specific scenes, individual scenes in a comic play as little rhetorical orations in themselves. Indeed, Love's Labour's Lost seems intent on carving out a distinctive space for these rhetorical performances, or contain instances of persuasive acts. Many of Byron's monologues, especially as we enter the long Act 4 catastasis, where the action clearly changes course to the men's persuasion of the women, stand as arguments on their own. But what does any of this have to do with racialization? Two major moments of persuasive action in the play's catastasis curiously involve their usage of racial markers. Byron's argument that Rosalind makes black fair, and the protagonists disguised as Muscovites accompanied by blackamoors to court the ladies, which I'll treat a little bit later. Ladan Niayesh explains that these references reveal the play's, quote, acute awareness of international conflicts, commercial networks, and early colonial endeavors which characterized that period of early globalization. Building on Niayesh's analysis, I wish to understand these moments from a different angle, that is, in terms of the play's poetic order. As he associates Rosalind's beauty with blackness, Byron declares that with rhetoric he would be able to prove her fair in this long monologue. Blackness in this period, as Kim Hall describes, highlights, quote, the role of color in organizing relations of power. And here Byron treats blackness as a function in a rhetorical exercise. In boasting that he is able to make black fair, Byron uses the discourse of blackness to prove that the force of rhetoric can overcome and subdue any challenges to move the comedic plot toward its fulfillment. Byron's ultimate championing of blackness as his love as black as ebony dematerializes blackness into a mere rhetorical tool for disposition. The next stage of courtly pursuit involves persuasion via a play within a play, as the main characters disguise themselves as Muscovites, accompanied by silent blackamoor musicians over there. And this is just a very small section where the blackamoor musicians, of course, do not feature as speaking, it's merely accompanying the main characters. And Matthew Chapman's theatrical history of black performers in Tudor England, as described in this play, reveals that, quote, the staging of exotic bodies functioned as a way for the royal court to demonstrate its mastery of the other, unquote. And as Cord Whitaker reminds us, we should attune to moments when premodern literature expresses a strategic use of black characters to define the goals and enhance the qualities of white characters. In poetic terms, the staging of blackness renders the blackamoor musicians as merely a part of a larger imitation of the action of persuasion. In other words, the performance of blackness becomes another pedagogical instance in the larger framework of comic unity. Building from Ania Lumba's characterization of racialization as the creation of internal hierarchies within a population, I argue that the play turns to the logic of racialization to ground and arrange elements of language and action through the work of poetics. Racialized actors like the blackamoors are brought in to make the scene's action cohere, but are treated merely as background. This process of persuasion neutralizes the threat of alterity represented by them. Muscovites are mere disguises, while the blackamoors do not serving as ornaments to the men's harmless, quote-unquote, courtship ploy. This treatment of blackamoors renders them not only as comic props, but also as figures of jest that help construct the unified operations of the comic plot. Italian humanist Gian Giorgio Trissino draws from Aristotle to see laughter in comic poetics as arising from a defect and an ugliness which is neither lethal nor painful. And of course, when an early modern Italian assures you that something is merely harmless, that is all the more reason to interrogate the phenomena further. Indeed, Love's Labour's Lost here shows that racialized figures are made to serve as mechanisms for comic deception and ridicule. as the play draws from poetics to contain and neutralize these actors into something, quote unquote, neither lethal or painful to the unity of the play or the character's actions. And as poetic theorists in the period also remind us, a key principle of comic poetics is its didactic function. While the ladies complicate the men's cloistered study and self-bridling of their own passions, the play concludes with a delay and romantic union for each pair that ultimately fulfills the goals set by Navarre in the opening speech. Byron protests that the parting of a 12th month and a day would be too long for a play, directly alluding to the unities of place and time to which the play generally adheres. But each man acquiesces to a year of quiet obedience and patience nonetheless. In this sense, the play has dutifully satisfied the didactic terms it has set for itself in Navarre's prologue, to patiently and obediently bridles one's affection for a circumscribed period of time and place. Racialized figures and discourse appear as a peripheral and unimportant, seemingly unimportant aspect of his pedagogical goal, but that is precisely the point of the play. The logic of early modern comic poetics can work to render social contradictions harmless, or wants to, for its artificial construction of unity to become legible on a formal sense. The play attempts to domesticate the unexplained intrusions, so to speak, and illusions that take us far beyond the confined space of white study by treating them as minor instances of pedagogy and exercises of poetic technique. And to fulfill the unity of its didactic function, the end of the play recruits Byron's previous rhetorical invocations of blackness to aid the construction of another process of identity differentiation. The play appears to discipline Byron for his rhetorical tricks by enforcing him to action that is useful to society. Rosalind faults him for being, quote, a man replete with mocks, full of comparisons and wounding flouts, and she delays marriage until he spends a year to, quote, visit the speechless sick and still converse with groaning wretches, and your task shall be with all the fierce endeavor of your wit to enforce to pain, impotent to smile, unquote. Throughout the play, all the world, as Byron's incorporation of exotic allusions to blackness and black figures show, all serve seemingly within the mercy of his wit. But here his wit loses its dominance. It must now endeavor to fulfill a task at the mercy of Rosalind's decision. Indeed, early modern poetic theorists have established the link between comedy's purpose and the self-education or self-disciplining of the individual. Another humanist reformer, Johannes Rivius, sees comedies as being read to correct our own behavior. And as Philip Melanchthon wrote, quote, comedies imitate the life, the chances, and counsels of men. They contain dangers because there is most occasion for fortune, counsels and fortune and dangers, unquote. For Shakespeare, domesticating what he thought of as dangers in the real circumstances of life, be it blackamoors or the unruly poor, bolsters the didactic, civilizing role of poetics. Italian humanist Minturno effectively brings together these various elements in his De Poeta. Quote, comedy is an imitation of life, mere of custom, image of truth, or that which treats of civil and private affairs devoid of danger, or what I think Aristotle most approves. It is an imitation for representing in pleasant plain speech some action of civil or private matters, not renowned, not serious, but certainly cheerful and ridiculous, and truly suited to the amendment of life and comprehending a perfect whole of just magnitude. This definition may seem self-evident at a first glance, but raises a series of questions about the naturalness of comedic principles and the functions they serve. What does it mean to make circumstances in nature devoid of danger? What does it mean to treat certain individuals as being dangerous at all, and suitable to the amendment of life by rendering them ridiculous? Indeed, the play aims towards the amendment of life in the Elizabethan status quo by concluding with the role of specifically the speechless sick, whom the Elizabethan poor laws would have considered as the impotent poor, and whom Byron must serve as his final lesson. In the Tudor period, the vagrancy laws, which are coupled often with these poor laws, but precedes them a little bit, were created to establish an artificial division between the abled body and impotent poor, crafting guidelines on who was disabled enough to legally beg and who would otherwise be criminalized for doing so. Thus, the play helps reify an existing social demarcation to identify exactly which kinds of marginalized subjects can serve as a means, as scholar Daryl Chalk puts it, for Byron to purge his own groaning, sickly love, unquote. In this sense, Rosalind mirrors Byron's rhetorical boasts of being able to make black fair by now challenging him to employ his wit to make the speechless smile. While some may see this as Byron channeling his rhetorical powers to better ends, in reality, the play is fitting and legitimizing the Elizabethan treatment of different marginalized people in relationship to each other in its contained world. Rosalind is not discontented with Byron's invocation of blackness per se, but with his hubris in thinking that his rhetorical dexterity can win her love. The play sees no problem that depictions of blackness can function only as rhetorical and dramaturgical playthings for courtly elites, unless these are used for unproductive ends, quote unquote, by gentlemen in need of correction. And people with disabilities here have no agency of their own, but serve as the means through which the gentleman redeems and atones for his missteps. Indeed, comedic principles aim to explore how the development of poetic unity on a formal level can depend on a prior logic of racialization, so that comedy might account for and cultivate other intersecting logics of internal differentiation of marginalized identities in English society. The play's obsession with unities animates the containment of different forces that it deems alien to its contained world, such that black figures can be seen in rhetoric or appropriated on stage without danger to its privileged inhabitants, and even the unruly poor outside of the play's immediate setting becomes only a pedagogical function of the King of Navarre's little academe. To conclude, while thinkers of poetics rarely explicitly touch on racecraft by the time of Love's Labour is Lost, what Melanchthon sees as the concrete life, chances, and counsels of men in early modern England inevitably reflect the symptoms of globalized exchange. Cord Whitaker writes that to examine the construction of something so often thought to be an exclusively modern phenomenon during its nascent stages and premodernity will at times feel like an anachronistic move, unquote. But as Ambrine Dadaboy and Neda Medazide write in Anti-Racist Shakespeare, Shakespeare's production, quote, articulate a premodern grammar of race well in advance of the systematized vocabulary used today to describe the process of racial formation, unquote. Such a premodern grammar of race can be traced back to the most basic theories and applications of early modern poetic tools and theories. To put it differently, early modern poetic theory itself can serve as a foundation of imaginative resources for playwrights to help construct logics of racialization. Part of my impulse to recover historical expression of poetics today is to problematize the common belief that the notion of poetics necessarily suggests something redemptive or reparative. What can emerge when we explore how early modern poetics function as a resource for maintaining the status quo, the racist status quo, preserving traditional hierarchies and developing new ones? How have writers recruited poetics for the neutralizing and bridling of social contradictions in early modern European society rather than empowering forces of resistance and subversion? Last night I decided to add a few more lines here to underscore the stakes of these questions. My talk was about how poetics constructs discursive unity and coherence from logics of racialization. The afterlives of this enterprise are well alive in our society today. So much of the founding myth of the United States relies on this impulse. I'm talking about how the systemic violence of this country against marginalized people and those who resist it are seen by some as mere proof that the idea of America ultimately works because it can respond to or learn from its mistakes, fulfilling a plot, a comedic arc of its own towards the fulfillment of so-called democracy that has been imagined for us. In another sense, the ramping up of state violence to neutralize the power of self-activity, self-protection, self-determination of those deemed dangerous helps complete the plot of white national unity. Ruth Wilson Gilmore once said that state-sanctioned murders, like what happened to Rodney King, help consolidate what she calls America's national resolution in fascism, right? A dramatic term here. When I started writing this talk, the LAPD murdered a black teacher, Keenan Anderson, 27 miles from where I live. As I was in the middle of writing this talk, Asian elders were murdered in a dance studio 2 towns away from where I live. And a forest defender, Manuel Turan, was killed by authorities in Atlanta. As I was finishing this talk, 10 Palestinians were killed in the refugee camp of Jenin. And just last night, the body count of Tyre Nichols' murder in Memphis by the state was released. I want to conclude by naming that our work here as BIPOC scholars of poetics is to continually identify, disrupt, and refuse attempts to subsume these tragedies into narrative unities that cohere, like ones about America as a polity that is ultimately flawed but still work in its resilient unity, because it doesn't. By uncovering what Deborah Priya labeled yesterday as invisible systems of meaning-making, we discover the power to expose and reject the ones that limit us. And to paraphrase James Baldwin, Only if we refuse to abdicate our responsibility for action, to discard the stories that cohere only for some, can we begin again, beginning new narratives and plots that actually serve our collective liberation. And that would require a whole different kind of poetics. Thank you.
Thank you, Promise. This is a fantastic talk, and thanks for being here. So I'm interested in this idea of comic unity that you come back to in this talk, and sort of references you were making to disability in the text. To what extent is well, first of all, I've been thinking about nonsense since last night, like non-stop nonsense. And to what extent is this notion, this very notion of comic unity even nonsensical, right? And then also ableist. Is nonsense ableist, and is comic unity ableist in this text and in your formulation?
Right. Yeah, really wonderful question. Thanks again. Yeah, it's an amazing way to look at it, right? I think centering on this notion of unity, right? I think you're absolutely right that there's so much that I think nonsensical is an interesting way to put it that I have to consider and think about a little bit. But I think what both of us are gesturing at here is that this notion of unity is constructed, right? It's artificially constructed. And, in a sense, that feels really intuitive, right? It's like we're scholars of literature and English, everything, social constructions, everything, forms constructed. But I think, what does it mean that we look at this archive of thinkers in the early modern period, right? Like Scaliger, Putnam, these people who are often not, really talked about, but in a sense, Shakespeare and everyone read, right? This is really a cornerstone. These are manuals, instruction manuals for how to not only think about crafting poetry, right? But just making rules to discourse, to language on a very fundamental level. Like, these are the people who are rigorously thinking about it. And what does it mean to think from their perspective, right? And to show that, yes, such notions and conceptions of unity in a play, in any work of art, right, actually requires a lot of thinking, right? It requires rules making, right? And these are the people who are actually doing these rules, right? And why is that not, right, a site to interrogate notions of ableism, racism, sexism, imperial, proto-colonialism, imperialism, etc., and things like that, right in these poetic manuals, right? Which, I feel like, a lot of folks in scholarship, they feel like this is kind of, people see this as kind of a different thing, right? It's like, oh, these people are just thinking about, I'm using Scaliger's book too, for example, because, he's one of the, probably one of the most famous scholars in the continent in his times, and he wrote this basic multi-book, work on poetics where he tries to categorize, right, every single kind of verse basically there as he can identify. That is, to me, an extremely powerful tool, right, to aid and to think about logic or racialization. And this is precisely, right, a site where we can start interrogating, right, how people started thinking of notions of poetic coherence, unity, and things like that. So I don't have a direct answer to the nonsense thing, but just to really echo and say, I think that's absolutely where I hope to keep, thinking about and get to. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Promise, for that wonderful talk to round things out today. I'm curious. I love the way you organize things around rule making, and of course, I think we both agree that rhetoric and the reception of classical rhetoric is just such a generative place to look. I'm curious if you could just say a little more about what you think about moments when those rules are very clearly changing, and how changes in the rules, or maybe a particular moment that you're thinking about where changes in the rules are a really valuable moment in racecraft. You know, you probably know I've thought a lot about the shift in metaphor from being about similitude to strife, right? So that's between the signifier and the signified. So that's the sort of thing that I'm putting in mind of right now.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, right? I think the reality is there is a massive literature, right, about poetic theory in the 16th century and the 17th century as well. But I think the key is that there's so many there's so much on it because there isn't a defined, right, notion of rule making. People, in fact, different people are offering slightly different kinds of rule making, and I think a lot of people, organically trace a lot of these people back to Aristotle, right? That whether Castelvetro, Scaliger, and whatever they're doing, or just commentaries to Aristotle, but in reality, those are they're actually advancing something new, right? I think we fail to consider oftentimes that these. What I see as politically conservative, right, reactionary attempts at rulemaking are actually fundamentally creative endeavors, right? And that's what makes them so powerful. And that's why our work here is needed, right? Is that we actually have to look at how, all these different humanist reformers, all these different poetic treatises are in dialogue with each other, right? And sometimes, the differences are in these little minute parts where, does Melanchthon consider the category of the unruly or the ridiculous in the same way as Minturno or Tracino or these other people I'm looking at? There are often very slight differences, right? About is the ridiculous already out there? Or are we just kind of co-opting it? Or are we just giving a form to it? What are the circumstances of life that comedy sought to relate to? Are those unruly? Or are those already mimicking nature? Like there's already some sort of logic to kind of things out there in circumstances of life that lends well to comedic unity. Like these are the stakes of the debates, right, between thinkers of poetics in the period. And so, I think in a sense, when you ask about when changes happen in these thinkers of poetics forms, I think, in fact, the Renaissance testifies to the fact that they're always changing. They're always shifting, right? The Renaissance itself, the project of humanism, is a kind of, right, like you said, the classical past, right, is a way to sort out the difference, the similarity, how to move on, how to relate to the classical past, right? And I think, the further part of this is, how are they all relating to each other? How are they all responding to each other in a discourse that seemingly is just about, right, poetic rules, right? But in a sense, this is actually about different ways of understanding world making, about rules to how world should work, how language should work, right? And kind of the symptom of that, right, is that they're actually negotiating, right, different ways that society ought to be structured, right? In terms, especially in this period when globalization increasingly continues to happen, is that this is not even just a kind of external layer in which people sort out their politics, right? In a sense, this is kind of the politics when we think about poetics in some sense. It's thinking about the category of politics in its most basic form, right? What does it mean to order things around? What type of order should society have? And how does that relate to nature and the real circumstances of life? So that's a long-winded answer to that wonderful question, yeah.
Promise, you ended your talk by beautifully, I thought, linking together some of the anti-Asian violence and anti-Black violence and talking about how that violence was part of what was going on for you as you were writing about rules. And I kept thinking about how right now I feel like we're in a cultural, socio-political moment where to talk about rules feels like nonsense. It feels absurd. Not to say that what you're doing is absurd, just to say that we just watched a video where it felt like all of the rules were broken. And I'm wondering, because you've evoked this history now, could you talk a little bit about your own writing process and your own methodology? How has it been shifted? How has it been changed by thinking through these questions while processing these kind of residual cultural traumas?
That's a big question. Yeah, that's a really meaningful question. I really appreciate you asking that. I think oftentimes our work can be seen as very divorced from our personal life, and in a lot of ways it's not. Running theme I think of a lot of my writing in graduate school the last couple of years is, obviously I write all of this to say I don't endorse. It's like for me there's a problem of why whenever, and like you said, all these atrocities and all these things happen in our society, somehow there's always an urge from not just politicians, right, but from a lot of folks in our community who are like, okay, how do we find the best way to how do we stop revolution from happening, right? It's like, how do we, okay, so some reforms here and there, it's like a lot of bad stuff is happening, but how can we all just calm down? Let's just be chill, right? Let's just, like, this is too much. And these things just happen again and again and again, right? And I think the question actually for me is, I'm completely convinced, right, of the potential for, revolutionary, transformative actions or kinds towards change, right? But the other thing that strikes me, right, being in different movement spaces in academia is no matter how bad things get, right? And I think this month we've seen exactly how bad things can get, right? And, we've seen versions of this before. There's still that impulse, right, of, some, Republican, Democrat coming out being like, this is a time for healing and unity, right? How can we move forward together? And every single year, right, with the legacy of Martin Luther King, we're reminded of this, right? Is that, this is a man who was hated, right? This is a man whose policies are not, this is not a unifying figure at the time, right? But at the same time, we keep rehashing the same thing, right? The CIA tweets the same thing every time about how much they love Martin Luther King, even though they, I'm sure a lot of folks know exactly what they did, right? But why is there this urge all the time, right? We need to go back to, I think one thing that really struck me during the last, really chaotic elections, right, was when Biden came out saying, we don't need revolution, we need results, right? We need to just, what's pragmatic, what can be fixed? Why is that urge there, right? And I think that's precisely the urge that's animating, all this writing I'm doing, right? Is that, what's the force, what's the power, right, of, these reactionary ideas where we're called to privilege unity over actually, radically thinking about how society should work or should function? Why is this impulse so intense? So by focusing on this, I think I always have to explain, like, I'm not studying this because I'm a conservative or something, but precisely the opposite, right? It's that, by actually understanding how we can move forward together as society in a radical way, right? We need to know how the other side works, right? We need to know why, not even a side or a group of people, but this impulse, right? An ideological impulse towards unity, towards stabilization, right? Towards social and political stability, even among some of the best of us sometimes, right? How does this urge, right, actually continually come up and trouble, right, our way to do, radical scholarship, radical activism, and things like that. So that's what animates me to write about, I think, a lot of the stuff in this sense, right, is that, how do we move forward, right, and why are these things so deeply rooted? And for me, the Renaissance, the Reformation becomes a place to interrogate a lot of these notions and ideas from its, kind of early proto form, where people are still actively sorting out, right, what unity should mean. Should there be unity, right? Like, what is unity in relation between society and nature and things like that? So it becomes a place for me, to sort out some of these ideas, which I still see as very present, like you said, today. But again, really grateful for that question.
Thank you so much for the talk. I think your response to I think that was Jamie's question was really helpful for me for a lot of reasons. And I was thinking a little bit about kind of what I think I hear you saying, and maybe I'm wrong, but some kind of notion of the relationship between poetics and like counterinsurgency. And this kind of tendency, staring at containment, I'm thinking about containment strategy specifically in terms of Cold War stuff and how that, like, these moments at different, of strife or of, the emergence of the third world or whatever it happens to be, or Reformation kind of times, kind of religious kind of background of these kinds of things and trying to flatten them out. And I'm just a little, if you wouldn't mind thinking a little bit aloud about kind of like that trope of the moments historically where like the excess that seems to be so rich, I mean, for someone that studies literature, right, of places to kind of push and to kind of forward a certain kind of potentially radical critique of what's been erased, but also to think about, these kind of counterinsurgent kind of impulses that you're talking about that also have their own kind of rhetorical devices and kind of preferences and so forth. And I think that what seems really rich about what you're proposing, at least, is that, like, that, I'm big on transhistorical things all of a sudden, but like trying to track that, a genealogy of those types of rhetorical moves, whether that's in Shakespeare or other things, that might be a nice really way to kind of connect that. So I was wondering if you could think about counterinsurgency and the rhetorical devices of that specifically?
Yeah. No, thanks for that question. I think, again, very meaningful. I think it's very much a context to which I'm responding to with some of my work, right? Yeah, very sympathetic, and of course, craving these moments of the counterinsurgent, right? And I think my response to this is saying that those moments of counterinsurgency, this is the work that folks here are already doing, right? And I think this is precisely the beauty of this conference, is showing a lineage, literally, right? We've gone through so many different eras and periods of how poetics can be energized, right, as a tool instead of counterinsurgency. And there's no way for me to lay claim to, right? And for me, I feel like I'm often kind of the bearer of bad news on the other side, where it's like, not to say, I think poetics definitely has a lot of transformative potential, right? And that's precisely the direction that we as a society, academia, whatever, should move towards, right? I'm always the one being like, but wait a second, right? Sometimes poetics can be very much the agent, the tool of the counterinsurgent, of the institutional, of the establishment, right? And sorry, sorry, wanting moments of insurgency and not wanting moments of counterinsurgency, but which is the focus of some of my research. But yeah, I think in terms of forms and poetics and speaking transhistorically, I think that needs to be, I think, part of my impulse to go back in this language and this focus on poetics. What early moderns thought about poetics is that these paradigms, right, these tools don't have to stick, right? And that's the impulse, that's this power for me of historical research, is saying that there's going to be another group of thinkers thinking about similar topics, right, and trying to mobilize them to a different end, right? And this requires, reckoning with how different historical figures, different historical writers responded to, right, critiqued, pushed back against, but at the same time, right, also, some of those who embody, who take on similar characteristics, right, unfortunately, of the counterinsurgent, right, that they've learned, and that both forces are always in text, and so to speak. And I think it requires a different kind, a different level, different attitudes towards research, right, for different periods to track exactly, how is the counterinsurgent, how does that stick, right, when we think about poetics across time period? How does it doesn't stick, right? How do people actually end up troubling them, right? And obviously the same goes for the insurgent, right? The revolutionary, the subversive. These things are always in flux, right? And that to me is the beauty of, thinking about poetics historically, is that we can excavate these different moments, right? Put some relationship to each other, and and at the end of the day, know exactly what to avoid, know what not to reproduce, right? And how to imagine a new kind of poetics together, which again, right, this is a collaborative process in which we're figuring this out, right? How to think about alternatives to this, because they're so deeply rooted, right? It really takes the community, a community of scholars with the right material conditions, right, to actually, advance these productive critiques. So,
Can we?
I would like everybody to thank Thomas Lee. And I guess we're moving on. Thank you. Thank you so much, and for rounding off your presentation with these final thoughts for us to think about.